They said no man would have her, and the mayor said it standing up, in front of the whole council, with his thumbs hooked in his vest like a man announcing the weather. By morning there was smoke rising from a building that had not existed the night before, and the men who raised it never said a word about why. That is the whole of it, and none of it, and you will want the rest. Coldwater Bend sat low in a fold of Kansas prairie, where the wind came down off the high plains with nothing to slow it, and in March of 1874, that wind still carried winter in its teeth. The grass had not greened. The mud in the wagon ruts froze hard by night and softened by noon into a paste that sucked at boot leather and wagon wheel alike, and the sky over the town was the flat white of a held breath. She rose before the sky did. Every morning for 31 months she had risen in the dark behind the mercantile, where a borrowed stove stood cold and iron black, until she coaxed it warm with kindling she split herself, her breath showing in the lamplight, her hands moving through the motions of dough and water and salt the way another woman might move through prayer. She did not think of it as endurance. She thought of it as Tuesday or Thursday or whatever day the section hands would come through hungry and short on coin, and she would feed them anyway and mark it in a ledger that had grown thick with names and debts that were never quite meant to be collected. Her husband had died of lung fever in August of 1871, coughing through a Kansas summer that should have healed him and did not, and left her a claim of 160 acres 2 miles out, and a house too quiet to live in alone. She had not gone back to it except to prove she still held it. She had stayed in town instead, close to the stove, close to the debts, close to the only work that asked nothing of her but what she already knew how to give. The bread she made was plain, rye, mostly, coarse and dark, because rye flour came cheap and kept well against the damp, but it was bread that section hands, and freight drivers, and lonely men ate standing up in the cold, and none of them ever asked her to be anything other than what she was while she handed it to them. One of those men came every Tuesday without fail, a blacksmith built like something the prairie itself had forged, who never said more than was needed and often said nothing at all. He came, he ate, he left a coin or a nail or a mended hinge in trade, and he never once looked at her the way the mayor's council would look at her, that March morning, when they decided what she was and was not entitled to keep. The forge stood 2 lots down from the mercantile, close enough that she could hear the ring of his hammer on slow mornings, when the bread was proofing, and there was nothing to do but wait. It was a sound she had come to trust, the way other women trusted church bells, steady, unhurried, marking hours that did not belong to grief. He worked from before light until after dark most days, shoeing horses and mending wagon iron and fixing whatever the town broke, and he asked no one's opinion of how he spent his hours, which was a freedom she envied without naming it as envy. That March the cold had not yet broken. Frost lay thick on the mercantile's back step each morning, and she rose before it, working the dough by lamp because her hands knew the shape of the loaves even when her eyes did not. 31 months of this had worn a path into her, not a rut exactly, but a groove, the kind water leaves in stone, given enough time and enough repetition. She did not think of it as hardship. She thought of it, when she thought of it at all, as the only shape her life had left to take. The council met on the second Tuesday of the month, in the room above the land office, where Trumbull kept his ledgers and his portrait of himself in a suit he had bought in Topeka. She had gone because the notice said homestead extensions were to be reviewed, and because the claim 2 miles out was the last thing her husband had left her that the bank could not touch. She had worn her good shawl, the one without patches, and had practiced what she meant to say the whole walk there, rehearsing it the way she rehearsed a recipe she had made 100 times and still did not trust herself to get right without saying the steps aloud. She did not get to finish saying it. The blacksmith was not there that morning. He had no business before the council, and no cause to sit in a hot room listening to men decide the worth of land he did not own. He was, at that hour, 3 streets over, fitting a new rim to a wagon wheel for a freighter passing through, his hands black to the wrist, his mind on iron and heat and nothing else, unaware that in the room above the land office, a mayor was about to stand, straighten his coat, and speak the sentence that would still be repeated in Coldwater Bend a year later, though by then it would be spoken with shame instead of laughter. The council room sat above the land office in a building that had once been a stable, and the beams still smelled faintly of horse and hay, under the newer smell of tobacco and men's sweat. 5 members of the council occupied the long table, and the mayor stood at its head, a man built for standing at heads of tables, thick through the middle in the way that comes from sitting rather than working, his coat a size too fine for a town that measured wealth in cattle and grain. She sat in the row of hard chairs meant for petitioners, her hands folded over the paper she had brought, the letter from her husband's homestead filing, the receipts showing she had paid what taxes could be paid, the ledger page where section hands and freight drivers had signed their names against bread they'd eaten and would pay for later. 31 months of proof that she had not let the claim go to seed or ruin. She had it all arranged in the order she meant to present it. The mayor did not ask to see the papers. He spoke instead of the extension as a courtesy the council had already discussed among themselves, out of her hearing, in the days before. He spoke of the difficulty of a woman working 160 acres alone, of the county's interest in land that produced, of the unlikelihood, here his voice found the register men use when they believe themselves to be stating a plain fact rather than an insult, that any man in the territory would take on a wife of her size, and so the claim would want a husband's labor it would never get. The room did not laugh, not at first. It was the quiet before the laughter, the little pause where men decide whether a thing said by an official is meant to be funny, and then one of the freighters near the back let out a short breath through his nose, and that was permission enough, and the rest of the laughter followed in the loose, scattered way laughter does when it is not quite sure of itself but glad of the excuse. She did not stand, she did not raise her voice, she folded her papers back into her shawl with the same care she used folding dough over itself, and she thanked the council for their time in a voice that did not shake, though her hands, when she stood, did. She walked the 2 miles home in the wind, past the mercantile, past the smithy where the ring of a hammer on iron carried out into the street, and did not pause, because the man swinging it did not yet know there was anything in the day worth pausing for. The wind that carried her home was the same wind that had scoured that country since before there were roads to walk, and it did not care what had been said in the council room, or that a man in a good coat had made a joke of a woman's body in front of 40 of her neighbors. Wind did not keep ledgers. She kept ledgers. That was the difference between her and the mayor, though she would not have put it in those words. Walking as she did, with her chin tucked against the cold, and her shawl pulled tight over papers that had just been refused. She had built her life those 31 months on exactness. 4 cups of flour to 1 of starter, proof twice, no more, no less, in weather that never once asked her permission to turn cold before the second rising was done. She had learned to read the sky the way other women read scripture, learned which clouds meant she should bank the borrowed stove low, and which meant she could let it run hot through the afternoon. She had learned the names of every freighter's mule, and which section hands took their bread with lard, and which wanted it plain, and she had written every unpaid loaf into a book, with a cracked spine, that she kept under a floorboard, because a woman alone could not afford to lose a debt to fire or theft. None of that had mattered in the room she had just left. A joke had mattered more. She did not cry on the walk, though the wind gave her cause enough, stinging her eyes until they watered, and calling it weather instead of grief was easy enough to do. She thought instead of the ledger, of the 31 months, of the husband who had coughed himself thin in a bed she still could not bring herself to sell, and she thought, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have already survived worse than they are currently enduring, that she would go on baking whether the council extended her claim or not, because bread did not require permission from Elias Trumbull. The smithy's hammer kept ringing behind her the whole way, steady as a heartbeat, and she did not look back at it, though something in her slowed near it, the way a hand slows near a stove it knows is warm. 2 years of Tuesdays had taught her the rhythm of that hammer, the particular pause he took between the 4th and 5th strike, and though she told herself she did not think of him beyond the bread he ate and paid for in coin, and the rare, wordless nod he gave her over the counter, she noticed, walking, that the ringing had not paused. He did not yet know. The wind that had carried her humiliation 2 miles down a rutted road had not yet found its way to him, and by the time it did, The light would already be going long and gold across the prairie, the particular gold of a Kansas evening in March, cold and clean and utterly unaware of what the night ahead intended to become. The forge sat at the north end of Coldwater Bend, where the road bent toward the livery, close enough to the mercantile that the mayor could hear the hammer from his office window, and had complained of it more than once, calling it a nuisance to men trying to conduct the business of a growing town. The blacksmith had never answered that complaint either, only worked later into the evenings after such remarks, as if the ringing itself were the only argument he cared to make. He had heard the council meeting was to be held that afternoon. Everyone in Coldwater Bend had heard, because the mayor had made certain of it, posting the matter on the board outside the church 3 days prior in handwriting large enough to be read from a horse. A widow's homestead extension, a public matter, he had called it, though there was little that was public about 6 men in a room deciding the fate of one woman who was not permitted to speak past her allotted 3 minutes. The blacksmith had not gone. He did not attend councils. He had learned, in 6 years of running the forge, that rooms full of men deciding things aloud rarely required anything of him but his taxes, and he preferred the heat of iron to the heat of argument. But the man who brought his plow blade in for sharpening that afternoon, a section hand who owed the widow 4 months of bread on credit and knew it, had stood in the doorway of the forge a long moment before he spoke, turning his hat in his hands the way men did when they carried something they did not want to carry alone. He told it plain, the size of her, the unlikelihood of any man taking her, the unlikelihood of any woman working land alone. The laughter, he said, had come from the back benches, though the mayor himself had only smiled, which was somehow worse. The hammer, which had been mid-swing when the man began, came down once more, cleanly, finishing the heat before it cooled uneven. Then it did not rise again. The section hand waited for something, a word, a curse, some sound to answer what he'd brought. He got none. The blacksmith set the hammer on the anvil with a care that seemed, to the man watching, almost unbearable, the way a person sets down a cup they are afraid of breaking by holding it too hard. Then he untied his leather apron, folded it once, and laid it over the anvil's horn, and stood a moment looking north, past the edge of town, toward the 2 miles of rutted road and the shape of a claim shed against the darkening line of the horizon, where the widow Vance was walking home alone, under a sky, going the color of a struck coin. The road she walked was the same road that had carried freight and rumor both for 20 years, rutted deep by wheels heavier than any single winter should have allowed, and she walked it now the way she had walked it every evening for 31 months, with her basket empty and her mind already reckoning the flour left in the bin against the mouths she'd fed that day on credit. She did not look back toward the forge. She had learned, early in her widowhood, that looking back cost more than it returned. The sky had gone the color the blacksmith had marked it, a struck coin, dull and bright at once, and the wind that came down off the high ground smelled of turned earth and wood smoke, and, underneath both, the mineral cold that meant frost again by morning, though the calendar called it spring. She did not know what had been said in the square that afternoon, not the particulars, though she had read enough in the mayor's face at the council table, in the way his mouth had shaped itself around the word size. Like a man handling something he found distasteful but necessary. She had not cried. She told herself this twice on the walk home, as if repetition were a form of proof. She had folded her hands and thanked the council for its time, the way her mother had taught her a woman thanked men who had just taken something from her, and she had walked out past the benches without meeting anyone's eyes, because meeting them would have cost her the one thing she still owned outright, which was her composure. Her claim shed stood where it had stood for 6 years, a single room of gray board and a stovepipe leaning off true, and beyond it, the 160 acres that had been theirs, and were now, by every word the mayor had spoken that afternoon, hers only on paper, and only until someone with better standing decided otherwise. She built her fire small, out of habit and out of thrift, and she set the borrowed pot on to heat water for the morning's dough, though she would carry the dough itself into town again tomorrow to bake it in the mercantile stove, the way she had every day since August of 1871. She did not know, banking the coals before she lay down, that 2 miles behind her, a man had folded his apron and was walking, not toward his own cold supper, but north, along the same rutted road, past the last lit window of town, carrying nothing yet but the shape of an idea, too large to say aloud even to himself. The night had gone still, the way March nights in that country went still, with the wind dying down to nothing after sundown, as if it too had somewhere else to be, and the cold that followed was a dry, clean cold that carried sound farther than it had any right to. He walked the 2 miles without a lantern because he did not need one. He had walked this road so many Tuesdays that his boots knew the ruts better than his eyes did, and besides, the moon was 3/4 full, and hard as a coin in a sky scrubbed clear of cloud. He passed the last lit window of town, which belonged to the mercantile, where a single lamp burned late over the mayor's ledgers, and he did not look at it. He had looked at it enough that afternoon, from the back bench, with his hands folded, the way a man folds his hands when he is holding something in, rather than letting it out. He had eaten her bread every Tuesday for 2 years. He had never once told her what it meant to a man who had come west with nothing to sit down at the end of a week, and be handed something warm, without having to ask twice, without having to explain the accounts of himself, without being weighed and found wanting. He kept no ledger of the meals the way she kept a ledger of debts, because a ledger was a kind of asking, and he did not ask. But he had counted, the way a smith counts heats on iron before he knows the metal is ready to move, and by his count the debt had grown too large for a man to carry silent much longer. When he reached his own forge, dark and banked for the night, he stood a long moment in the yard, looking at the shed that had housed it for 6 years. Plank walls he had raised himself, brick footing he had laid by hand the summer he arrived, a roof patched twice against hail. It was not a fine building. It had never needed to be fine. It had needed only to keep the rain off the anvil and the wind off the fire, and it had done that faithfully. And now he looked at it the way a man looks at something he has decided, without argument, to tear down. He did not go inside for supper. He went instead to the crowbar hanging by the door, and to the sledge leaning in the corner, and he carried both out into the yard, and set them against the near wall of the shed, and stood there a moment more with his breath showing white in the moonlight, as if giving the building one last chance to object. It did not. He set the crowbar to the first board and pulled. The board came away with a sound like something waking, a long groan of nails surrendering wood, and he set it down flat in the grass rather than let it fall, because even in tearing a thing apart he could not bring himself to be careless with it. The second board came easier. The third came in his hand almost whole, and he stacked it with the first, and by the fourth he had found the rhythm of it, the particular give of old pine that had dried 6 winters on that frame, and his arms, which had shaped iron all day and felt no different now, only warmer with purpose, began the work of undoing what they had once built. The moon was 3/4 and climbing, throwing his shadow long and black across the yard, and by its light and by feel he worked the wall apart board by board, then post by post, prying each upright from its footing with the crowbar's flat end, and rocking it loose the way a man works a stubborn tooth, patient, unhurried, because haste breaks what patience saves. The brick footing came harder. He went to his knees in the cold dirt with the sledge's claw end, and worked the mortar apart joint by joint, and here his hands remembered a different arithmetic than the anvil's. Not force, but angle, not the blow, but where it landed, and one by one the bricks came free, black with old soot on one face, rough and true on the other, and he set them in a growing pile at the yard's edge, counting nothing, only stacking, the way he had stacked coal and iron and firewood his whole life, without needing to know the sum to trust the pile was enough. Sweat came despite the cold, and he stopped once to strip his coat and hang it on the fence post, and stood a moment with his shirt open at the throat, and the steam rising off him into air sharp enough to cut, and he did not look tired. He looked like a man doing sums in his head that had only one answer. By the time the shed stood open to the sky, roofless, 3 walls down and the 4th leaning drunk on its last post, the moon had crossed a good third of its arc, and he had not once looked toward the road, had not once wondered whether anyone would come, had built his plans the way he built everything, assuming only his own 2 hands, and the brick, and the hours he was willing to spend. It was near 9 when he heard the first wagon wheel on the frozen ruts beyond the fence. Slow and deliberate, a team walked rather than driven, and he straightened from the pile with a brick still in each hand and turned toward the sound, unsurprised, as a man is unsurprised by weather he has already read in the sky. The wagon came into the yard light of the fire he had built to see brick by, and the man driving it he had known 6 years, a section hand with a wife and 4 children, and a debt in the ledger that ran back to the winter. His youngest took the croup and would eat nothing but her soft bread soaked in broth. The man climbed down without a word of greeting, only a nod, and went to the brick pile as if he had been told exactly where to stand. Behind him came a second wagon, and a third close on its heels, wheels grinding slow through the frozen ruts, lanterns swinging at the sides throwing long broken light across the snow-crusted grass. Men climbed down one by one. A freight driver who owed her 4 months of loaves for the winter he'd broken his leg on the Ellsworth Road and eaten nothing else while he mended. The miller's boy, grown thick in the shoulders now, whose mother had died the same year as the widow's husband, and who had eaten at her stove more evenings than his own kitchen those first hard months. A man who ran cattle north of the section line and had never once paid coin for bread in 2 years, only labor when labor was asked, and silence the rest of the time, which she had accepted as payment enough. He did not count them as they came, though later, much later, someone else would, and the number would settle at 11 and stay there in the telling. He only watched the yard fill, watched the brick pile draw men to it the way water draws cattle, and felt something move through his chest that he had no word for and did not go looking for one. He set down the 2 bricks he had been holding and picked up 2 more. No one asked what they were building. No one needed to be told the plan, because the plan was brick and lot and a woman who fed half the section hands on credit, and had been told before the whole town that no man would have her and no woman could hold ground alone. The men understood the arithmetic without it being spoken, the way men on a frontier understand weather, debt, and shame, as things that do not require explanation, only response. They worked in near silence, the only sound the scrape of brick on brick, the huff of breath in cold air, the occasional low word passed between 2 men lifting a beam. The moon rose higher, the fire popped and threw sparks into the dark, and by the time the church bell in town rang midnight, muffled and far off across the frozen fields, the first course of the new wall stood a foot above the frost line, square and true, rising out of the ruin of the old shed, like something that had always meant to be there. The cold did not let up. It came down off the plains, in long, patient sheets, finding the gaps in coat collars and the spaces between glove and wrist. And still the men worked, because stopping was colder than continuing. Someone had thought to bring a kettle, and it hung now over a second fire near the wagon, filling with snowmelt and prairie grass tea that scalded the tongue and did nothing for the ache in the shoulders but was drunk anyway, passed hand to hand without a word of thanks expected or given. The blacksmith did not stop to drink. He worked the mortar himself, mixing it in a trough dragged from his own yard, testing the set of it with 2 fingers, the way she tested the give of dough, though neither of them would have made the comparison aloud. His hands, scarred from 20 years of forge work, moved over the brick with a strange gentleness, setting each one the way a man sets something he does not intend to have to set twice. By 1 in the morning, the wall had climbed past a man's knee, past his hip, and the shape of the room was beginning to declare itself against the dark, a rectangle of raw brick standing up out of the frozen ground, where an hour before there had been only the flattened footprint of a torn-down shed. One of the men, older than the rest, gray at the temples, stood back a moment to look at it and said, to no one in particular, that it looked like a chapel going up. Nobody answered him, but nobody told him he was wrong. 2 miles off, in town, a lamp burned low in an upstairs window of the mayor's house, and if he had looked out across the black fields, toward the widow's claim, he might have seen the glow of the fires, small and far and strange, like something fallen from the sky and still burning. But he did not look. He had gone to bed satisfied with the shape of his own day, the vote recorded, the matter closed in his mind the way a ledger is closed at the bottom of a column. and he slept without knowing that 2 miles east of his window, a debt was being paid in brick and sweat that he had never agreed to owe. The widow herself slept fitfully in the back room of the mercantile, waking twice to the sound of wind that was not wind, some vibration under the floorboards that might have been wagon wheels on the frozen road, might have been nothing at all. She did not know to listen for hammers. She did not know that a mile and more away, under a sky gone hard and bright with stars, a wall was rising, with her name already fixed to it, in the minds of 11 men who had eaten her bread on credit, and meant, before the sun came up, to see the debt made square. By midnight the frost had a sound of its own, a fine crackling in the grass like something breathing through its teeth, and the 11 men worked inside a ring of firelight that made the prairie beyond it seem to fall away into nothing, as if the whole dark world had shrunk to the size of one lot and one labor. The blacksmith did not direct them so much as move among them, correcting a course of brick with 2 fingers, setting his shoulder under a beam another man had misjudged, and always coming back to the mortar trough where he worked the lime and sand and water with his bare, scarred hands, because he trusted no other hands to get the proportion right. He had done the sums for this oven 100 times in his head on Tuesday evenings, watching her work the borrowed stove in the back of the mercantile, counting the losses in her cooking that a proper hearth would save her, the burnt bottoms, the wasted wood, the loaves she pulled too soon because she could not trust the heat. He built now the oven he had built for years in his mind, and his hands, moving through cold that numbed other men's fingers to stumps, did not falter. 2 of the men were freight drivers who owed her for bread on runs when their own supply had spoiled in the wet. 3 were section hands who had eaten at her backstep through 2 winters of thin wages. 1 was an old Norwegian with a bad hip who could not lift brick, but held the lantern steady for 4 hours without complaint, because holding light steady was a debt he could still afford to pay. They spoke little. What talk there was concerned the work only, a level, a missing nail, the angle of a header course, and beneath the talk ran something none of them named, a current of shared reckoning, as if each man understood that he was not merely laying brick, but settling an account that had gone too long unpaid, in a town too quick to forget who had fed it through the lean months. By 2 in the morning the walls stood chest high, and the chimney had begun its climb, brick over brick, true and plumb, the mortar smoking faintly where it met the cold. Somewhere past 3, snow began, fine and dry, and the men worked through it as they had worked through the wind, wrapping rags tighter over their knuckles, passing a jug of coffee gone lukewarm hours before. The blacksmith straightened once, looked long at the sky where the stars had begun to dim toward the false gray that comes an hour before real dawn, and set his hand flat against the rising brick, as a man might set his hand against the flank of a horse he trusted to carry him the rest of the way. The snow thickened toward 4, and with it came the cold that tests a man past the reach of his coat, the kind that finds the seam of a glove and works in like a splinter. Still the wall climbed. The chimney passed the height of a standing man, and 2 of the 11 set to work on the flue while the rest turned to the shop front, framing the door where the deed would hang, though none of them knew yet what words it would carry. A plank was hoisted for a counter. Someone had thought to bring glass, wrapped in sacking against the jostle of the wagon, and this was set aside with the particular care men reserve for things they do not understand the value of but respect anyway. She woke near 5, though she had not meant to sleep at all, and lay a moment in the dark of the mercantile's back room, listening to a silence that did not feel like silence, a hum under it, faint and steady, like a mill wheel 2 farms over. She rose, dressed by feel, and stepped out into snow falling slant across the lantern light of town, and stood there long enough that her breath went to frost on the wool at her collar before she understood the light she saw was not lantern light at all, but firelight, banked low in a chimney that had not existed when she'd gone to sleep. She did not run. She had not run anywhere in 31 months, not from grief, nor from debt, nor from the mayor's voice ringing off the council room rafters, and she did not run now. She walked, boots breaking new snow, past the smithy's dark and empty doorway, out along the frozen rut of the road toward the 2 miles that were hers by claim and, she had believed until that morning, hers by claim alone. The men saw her coming before the blacksmith did. They went quiet, not from shame, but from a kind of held breath, the way men go quiet in a church they do not often visit. He turned last, brick still in his hand, mortar drying gray along his wrist, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the falling snow settling white on his shoulders and in the wool of her shawl, and the fire behind him threw his shadow long across the frozen yard until it reached her feet. He set the brick down. He wiped his palm once against his trouser leg, an old habit, useless now, and stepped back from the wall so she could see the whole of it, chimney, oven mouth, the black iron door already hung and cooling from its first small fire, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing a man could say that the brick had not already said better. She stood there a long moment, the cold working its way up through the soles of her boots, and did not trust herself to speak either. Behind her the road she had walked stretched back toward town, empty now, gray with the coming light, and ahead of her stood a building that had not existed when she had gone to sleep in the mercantile's back room with the flour sacks for a pillow. She counted the men without meaning to. 11, she would learn later, though in that moment she only knew there were more hands here than she owed bread to in a season, more shoulders than she could name debts for. Some she recognized by their coats, a freight driver who had eaten on credit through 2 winters, a section hand who had brought her a jar of honey once, wordless, and left before she could thank him properly. They stood now with brick dust on their knuckles and steam rising off them in the cold, not looking at her directly, the way men avoid looking at something too large to take in all at once. The oven's mouth glowed faint orange behind the blacksmith, banked low, patient, the first fire of a thing meant to hold fire for years. She saw where the mortar had frozen crooked in 2 places where hands had worked too fast in the dark, and she saw where it had been done right everywhere else, plumb and true. The brick laid the way a man lays brick when he means for a wall to outlive him. The shopfront's window, salvaged glass, threw back the gray dawn and her own shape in it, small and round-shouldered in her shawl, and behind that reflection, the black shape of the door. She did not ask what it cost. She did not ask who had given permission, or what the mayor's council would say when they woke to smoke where no smoke should be. Those questions would come, and they would matter, and they would be answered in rooms she had not yet entered. For now there was only the fact of it, brick and mortar and iron, raised in a single night by men who owed her flour and eggs and the small mercy of a hot meal on a hard road, none of them owing her this, none of them owing her a building. She walked past the blacksmith without a word, her boots crunching new snow, and laid her palm flat against the oven door where the iron had already begun to warm from the fire inside it. It did not burn her. It only held, steady under her hand, the first thing in 31 months that had not asked her to be smaller than she was. The men who had built through the night did not linger to be thanked. They had come without asking, and they left the same way, shouldering tools gone quiet, their breath fogging white in the cold that comes just before a Kansas dawn breaks warm. One by one their wagons creaked back down the 2 miles of frozen rut toward town, and the sound of them faded the way sound fades over open country, thinning until it was only wind again, only the low complaint of grass under ice. She stood a long while at the oven door before she moved to the shopfront glass and studied the shelves that were not shelves yet, only planks laid across brick, waiting for flour sacks that did not exist, for loaves that had not been mixed. The building around her still smelled of green mortar and char and man-sweat, not yet of bread. That would come. She understood this, the way she understood proving dough, that a thing must sit in its own time before it becomes what it is meant to be, and no amount of wanting hurries it. The blacksmith worked at the hearth in silence, banking coals for the day's heat, his back to her, his shoulders still carrying the set of a man who has not slept and does not intend to speak of it. She watched him a moment. He did not turn. By mid-morning the smoke had drawn the eye of half the town. A boy delivering milk stopped his cart in the road and stared. A woman hanging wash forgot the line in her hands. Word does not travel in Coldwater Bend so much as it detonates, and by noon there were 3 wagons stopped along the fence line, men and women standing in the cold with their hands shading their eyes against the low sun, looking at brick where the night before there had been only snow and a woman's homestead lot with nothing built on it at all. No one crossed onto the land. They only looked, the way people look at weather changing on the horizon, uncertain yet whether it will pass them by or break directly overhead. She did not go out to them. She swept mortar dust from the plank floor instead, her broad hands steady on the broom handle, and when the blacksmith finally came to stand in the doorway behind her, dropping his voice below even his usual near silence, he said only 2 words, rough as the iron he worked. "Bake something." She looked at him. He held her gaze the way he held a hot horseshoe, careful, deliberate, unwilling to let it drop and burn something it shouldn't. Then he turned back to his coals, and she understood that the watching crowd along the fence would need more than smoke to believe what they were seeing. She went to fetch her flour sack from the borrowed stove in town, walking past the wagons without looking at a single face in them, though she felt every eye follow her the whole way down the road. The walk to town and back took the better part of an hour, and she used every minute of it to steady her hands. March had turned the road to a ribbon of mud between hard frozen ruts, and she picked her way along the edges where the ground still held, her boots crusted white by the time she reached the mercantile's back door. The stove there was cold, banked low for the season, and she built the fire up herself, the way she had built it up every morning for 31 months, kneeling before the iron grate, with the same patience she gave to everything that resisted her. She did not weep, though there was a moment, feeding kindling into the coals, when her throat closed of its own accord, and she had to wait it out before she could breathe evenly again. She measured her flour by feel, the way her mother had taught her, and she mixed the dough in the same bowl she had carried back and forth across that kitchen for 2.5 years, chipped at the rim, gray with age. The yeast she'd started that morning, out of habit more than plan, as though some part of her had known the day would ask something of her before it ended. By the time she carried the risen dough back out to the road, wrapped in a cloth against the cold, the sun had climbed high enough to throw hard shadows across the snow, and the wagons along the fence had not thinned. If anything, there were more of them now, drawn by whatever word travels on a frontier morning, faster than any rider could carry it. She did not look at them. She crossed the yard to the new oven, its brick still dark with the night's heat held inside it like a secret, and she found that the blacksmith had already opened the iron door and raked the coals to the sides, exactly as she would have asked, had she needed to ask him anything at all. She shaped the loaves on the plank counter he had built along the window, working the dough with the flat of her palm, folding it, turning it, her broad hands moving in the same rhythm they had moved in for years, in a kitchen half this size with a stove a quarter this good. The blacksmith stood at his forge across the shared wall, not watching her directly, though she noticed he had slowed his hammer, that the ring of iron on iron came less often than it should have for a man at honest work. She slid the first loaves into the oven on the long paddle he had shaped for her from an old wagon board, and she shut the iron door, and she waited, listening to the fire breathe inside the brick, the way she had once listened to her husband breathe in a fevered bed, hoping for the same thing both times. That the thing she loved would hold. The oven held. She knew it by the smell before she knew it by anything else. The way rye and coarse wheat began to sweat their sugars in heat, the crust starting to set before the crumb had finished rising. A smell she had chased for 31 months across a stove that never once ran even. Here the heat moved through the brick the way water moves through a creek bed, worn smooth, patient, and without hurry, and she stood with her hand flat against the outer wall and felt it climb steady under her palm. No cold patches, no sudden flare. Whoever had laid this brick had laid it the way a man lays brick who intends for it to outlast him. She did not let herself think long on who that was. There was work in front of her, and work was a kind of mercy. It kept the mind from wandering into rooms it had no right to enter yet. The first hour she baked 6 loaves and burned none. The second hour she baked 10 and gave 2 away, because the wind carried the smell out past the shop front and down the lot line, and 2 of the 11 men who had raised the walls in the night came back at first light, not for coin, not for the debt already paid in labor, but because they had smelled bread, and their stomachs did not know the difference between a debt settled and a debt renewed. She fed them at the counter, standing, the way she had fed men for 2 years in the mercantile's back room, and neither of them mentioned the wall come down or the wall gone up, only the bread, only whether she had salt enough, only whether the roof would hold against the spring rain that was already gathering gray along the western edge of the sky. Across the shared wall, the hammer had gone quiet altogether now. She did not go to see why. She had learned, in 2 years of Tuesday deliveries and 2-word conversations, that a silence from the blacksmith was rarely an absence. It was a kind of attention, turned inward, the way a man goes still when he is deciding something and does not yet trust himself to say it, even to no one. She pulled the second batch and set the third to rise. And outside the window, the town was beginning to stir in earnest now. Wagon wheels finding the ruts, a dog barking twice and going silent, someone's rooster, very late and very insistent. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the loaves cooling in their row along the plank counter, 12 of them, gold-backed and split along the top, the way good rye splits when it has been shaped by someone who has shaped 10,000 loaves before it. 12 loaves, 88 more before the freight master came through in 6 weeks' time, if the count in her head was to mean anything at all. She began shaping the next batch before the thought had finished forming. The morning had gone the color of weak tea by the time she carried the first tray out to the shop front to cool where passers-by could see it, which was its own kind of quiet argument, though she had not meant it as one. She set the tray on the sill and stood back and looked at the window glass, still tacky in its putty, still smelling faintly of linseed, and beyond it, the street, where a woman from the dry goods store had stopped, with a basket on her hip, and was looking, frankly looking, the way people look at a thing they have decided to disbelieve, until it stands in front of them. The woman did not come closer. She only looked, and then moved on toward the mercantile, and the baker told herself that was one. That was a beginning, though she did not know yet what it was the beginning of. By mid-morning, the smell had done what the smell always did. It went down the street the way water goes downhill, without asking permission, and pulled 2 boys from the schoolyard fence, and a farmhand from the feed store step, and none of them bought anything, and none of them needed to. They stood at a respectful distance, the way men stand at a respectful distance from a fire they are not sure yet is theirs to warm themselves at. She let them stand. She had learned that too, in 31 months of feeding men who owed her more than they could pay. That hunger made its own patience, and patience made its own kind of manners, and if she only waited, the manners would win out over the shame of wanting. The blacksmith came around from the side lot near noon, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms still marked with brick dust gone gray in the creases of his knuckles. He did not speak. He set a second sawhorse under the counter's far end, testing it with his weight before he trusted it to hers, and then he took up a rag and began wiping down the plank surface where flour had drifted in a fine white silt from the morning's shaping. It was not a task anyone had asked of him. It was not a task that needed doing so much as it needed a reason for him to stay near the oven a while longer without appearing to linger. And she understood that too, the way she had come to understand most of what he did not say. She handed him a heel of the first loaf without being asked, the way she had every Tuesday for 2 years, and he took it the way he always took it, with both hands, as though it weighed more than bread ever should. He ate standing at the counter's edge, looking out through the new window at the street, at the woman with the basket now 3 doors down, and still not looking back. And the baker went on shaping loaves behind him, counting under her breath. 13, 14, the numbers climbing the way the smoke climbed, steady, unhurried, certain of where it was going. The morning went on the way. Mornings on the prairie always went once. The sun cleared the grain elevator, warming by degrees no one noticed until the frost was gone from the wagon ruts, and the mud beneath had softened enough to suck at boot heels. She counted her loaves to 30 before the freight agent's clerk came by with his ledger book, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, who said nothing about the mayor or the mercantile, only asked what she charged the dozen, and wrote her answer down without argument, which was its own kind of verdict. By midday, the smell of the bread had done what no crier could have done for a nickel. Women who had not spoken to her since before her husband's fever came now with baskets and small coin, standing at the new counter, as though it had always been there, as though the frost of 6 weeks past had never touched their mouths when they spoke her name in the mercantile. She served them the same way she served everyone, without comment, weighing loaves on the borrowed scale, until a proper one could be bought, and if she noticed which women had turned from her in March and which had not, she did not let it show in the set of her hands. The blacksmith finished his heel of bread and set the rag down, and went back to the forge side of the wall, where his own fire wanted tending, and for a while the sound of hammer on iron kept time under the murmur of the bakery like a second, older pulse. She heard it the way she had heard it every day for 2 years, except now it came through her own wall, in her own building, and she found herself listening to it, not as the sound of a neighbor's trade, but as something closer to a heartbeat shared between 2 rooms. Near 2 o'clock, the mayor's clerk walked past the window twice, slow both times, and did not come in. She watched him go by the second time and said nothing, only slid a fresh tray from the oven and set it to cool, the loaves ticking faintly as their crusts settled, the sound small and private and entirely her own. Outside, the wind had shifted southward and carried off the last of the morning's chill, and the road that ran past her door, the same road the freight wagons would take in 6 weeks' time when the contract came up for its tasting, lay pale and rutted and empty in the early afternoon light, waiting the way roads wait, indifferent to what would eventually travel it, though she found herself looking down its length anyway, as if she could already see the wagons coming. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them named but both understood. She rose before the first gray light touched the window glass, and by the time the sky had gone the color of weak tea, the smell of her bread had already crossed the 2 miles into town, on whatever wind was blowing that morning, so that the section hands walking in for work would sometimes stop and lift their heads like dogs catching scent, and grin, and walk faster. He rose earlier still, before her, and the sound of his bellows starting up was the first sound she heard each day, besides her own breathing, a low huffing rhythm through the shared wall that told her the world had not stopped turning in the night. Neither of them spoke of it. There was no need. The wall did the speaking that words would only have gotten wrong. The ledger she kept, the same one, its cover softened now to the texture of cloth, filled with new lines. Flour bought outright, for the first time in 31 months, instead of borrowed against a hand-me-down stove. Coin taken in from the freight drivers, who no longer waited for credit terms, but paid across the counter, some of them looking faintly ashamed to be handing over money to a woman they had once simply expected to feed them. She did not remind them of the difference. She only counted what was owed and what was paid, and closed the book each night with the same flat satisfaction a farmer takes in a fence that finally holds. Word of the bakery traveled the way word travels on a prairie, slow and then all at once, carried in wagon beds and saddlebags to the next section and the next, so that by the middle of April, strangers came through Coldwater Bend asking after the widow's ovens, the way they might ask after a good well or a safe ford. She fed them plainly, without ceremony, and watched them ride on satisfied, and did not think of herself as anything other than a woman doing the work in front of her. The mayor's clerk came by twice more that week, each time slower than the last, each time saying nothing, and each time she noted his passing without comment, the way she noted weather, a fact of the season, not yet a threat, but not nothing either. The tasting was 6 weeks off now, and closer every morning. She had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to count loaves the way other women counted days until a wedding, and to look down the empty road past her door and imagine it full. The rains came in the 3rd week of April, hard and cold and sideways, the kind of storm that turned the road to the bakery into a channel of brown water and made the chimney smoke lean flat against the roofline before it could rise. She banked the ovens low that week, rather than let them go out entirely, feeding them just enough to keep the brick warm through the wet, and she and the blacksmith worked in a rhythm that had stopped needing words somewhere around the 2nd week of March, and never gone back to needing them. He came at dawn to check the roof seams against the weather, running his palm along the ridge, the way a man checks a horse's leg for heat, and left before the bread was ready, and came back at dusk to eat what was left, and this was the whole of it, day after day, and it was enough. The freight road itself washed out twice, delaying the wagons that would have carried word of her ovens further west, and for 4 days, the town was quieter than it had been in months, hunkered under the rain, section hands idle in the bunkhouses, the mercantile's porch empty of the men who usually traded gossip there. She used the lull to test her flour against the wet, a batch gone heavy and sour before she caught it. Another she pulled too early, and had to feed to the hogs behind the mercantile rather than sell. And she kept a hard accounting of every failure the way she kept her ledger, in plain figures, without excuse. The mayor, she heard from the clerk's wife, had taken the delay as a kind of vindication, telling anyone who would listen at the council table that a woman's bakery could not be trusted to hold up against a hard season, that the freight line needed reliability, and not a novelty, built in one strange night by an idiot with a hammer. The words came back to her second-hand and blunted, the way all such words did, softened by the distance they traveled, but she heard the shape of them clearly enough, and did not flinch. She sent no answer. She had learned that much in 31 months of widowhood, that the loudest defense a woman could make was simply to keep the ovens lit through weather that would have closed a lesser kitchen, and to be standing in the doorway, flour to the elbow, when the sky finally cleared. On the 5th day the rain broke into a hard blue morning, and she stepped out to see the road drying in long silver ribbons under the sun, and somewhere down that road, though she could not yet see it, the first wagon of the season was already turning toward Coldwater Bend. The wagon came slow, its wheels cutting fresh grooves through the drying mud, the mules leaning into their traces with the patient weariness of animals that had crossed 100 miles of thawing prairie to reach this one bend in the road. She heard it before she saw it, the creak of axle wood, the low complaint of harness leather, and she set down the peel she had been using to check the coals, and went to stand in the doorway her husband's death and 31 months had built toward without her ever naming it so plainly to herself. The freight master rode ahead of the wagon on a gray gelding gone shaggy, with winter coat not yet shed. He was a spare man, weathered the way rope gets weathered, and he did not look at the bakery first. He looked at the smoke, steady and thin above the new chimney, and something in his face, not warmth, not yet, but attention, settled there before he ever brought his eyes down to her. Behind her, the ovens held their heat the way she had built them to hold it, brick soaking in the fire until the whole structure breathed warmth back into the room, and on the long table, the morning's loaves stood cooling in their rows, 100 of them, crusts dark and cracked in the particular way that told a baker's eye everything before a single bite was taken. She had counted them twice before dawn, not because she doubted her own arithmetic, but because counting was a kind of prayer, and she had said it twice to be sure. The blacksmith came out from the forge side of the shared wall, wiping his hands on a rag gone black with iron, and stood a little apart, near enough to be present, far enough to make plain whose doorway this was. The freight master swung down from his horse in the mud without ceremony and walked toward the smell before he walked toward the woman making it, which she took, correctly, as the highest compliment the moment could offer. He tore a loaf in half with his bare hands, not waiting to be invited, and the steam that came up off the torn bread hung in the cold morning air, like something with its own weight and shape. He ate standing in the road, in full view of anyone in Coldwater Bend who cared to be watching, and behind the mercantile's front window, the mayor was watching, though he did not come out. The freight master chewed, swallowed, and looked at her the way a man looks at a fact he cannot argue with, and he said the words plainly, without flourish, the way men on that road had learned to say, the only words that mattered. "I'll take the 100, he said, "and whatever you can bake me next week." The words went through the crowd the way water goes through cracked ground, quick and low and finding every seam. Someone laughed, not unkindly, and someone else repeated the number back, 100, and whatever she could bake him next week, as though saying it twice would make it more true. The section hands who had eaten her bread on credit for 2 winters straightened where they stood, the way men do when a thing they always suspected is finally said out loud by someone with the authority to make it matter. She did not smile. She wiped her hands on her apron, once, and reached for the ledger she had brought without being asked to bring it, the same ledger that had carried names and debts for 31 months, and she opened it to a fresh page and wrote the freight master's name at the top in a hand that did not shake. The mercantile's door did not open. The mayor stood behind his glass with his coffee going cold in his hand, and those close enough to see him said later that he did not look angry so much as confused, the way a man looks when the ground he has stood on his whole life shifts half an inch, and he cannot yet say which direction. He had built his bid on flour, bought cheap, and freighted in from the county seat, on numbers written neat in a book that had never once been tested against a hungry man's mouth. He had not accounted for smoke rising from a lot that had been empty at sundown. He had not accounted for a woman he had called too much of everything standing in the mud with her sleeves pushed to the elbow, selling bread by the loaf to the only buyer who mattered, while 11 men, who owed her flour and coin and favors, stood near enough to be counted as witnesses. The freight master paid her in coin on the spot, counted into her palm without her having to ask twice, and swung back up onto his horse with a fresh loaf tucked under his arm, like a man who had gotten the better end of a trade and knew it. The crowd began to break apart the way crowds do, in 2s and 3s, already carrying the story off toward their own kitchens and barns, where it would be told again by supper with the details sanded down or sharpened depending on who told it. The blacksmith did not move from the wall. He watched her count the coin twice, the way she counted flour, careful and unhurried, and when she looked up at him, there was nothing in her face that asked for anything, only the plain, tired satisfaction of a woman who has finally been paid, in full daylight, for work the whole town had watched her do. The mayor did not stay to watch the coin change hands. He had turned back toward his mercantile before the freight master swung down from his horse, walking fast, the way a man walks when he wants the walking itself to look like purpose rather than retreat. Nobody called after him. Nobody needed to. The council would meet again within the week, and the contract would be entered into the county ledger under a name that was not his store's, and that fact would sit in Coldwater Bend the way a stone sits in a boot, small and impossible to ignore with every step. By the following Tuesday, the freight wagons that had once stopped at the mercantile loading dock were stopping instead at the low brick building with the shared chimney, and the men who drove them had learned to time their runs so they could carry away bread still warm enough to steam in the cold morning air. The blacksmith kept the forge fire lit through those mornings same as always, the ring of his hammer keeping time with the thump of dough turned out onto the floured board on the other side of the wall, and the two sounds together became, without anyone deciding it should, the sound of that end of the street. The widow's ledger, the one she had kept for 31 months of debts owed to her in flour and coin and favors, began at last to close. Men who had eaten on credit through 2 winters came in with dollars now instead of promises, some of them sheepish about it, some of them simply relieved, and she crossed their names out with the same steady hand she used for kneading, no more ceremony in the closing of a debt than in the opening of one. The mayor's authority did not collapse. He kept his seat on the council through the spring and into summer, kept his store, kept his voice at meetings, though men listened to him now, the way they listened to weather reports from a man who had been wrong about the weather once, publicly, in front of everyone. He was not driven from town. He was simply, from that morning on, a smaller figure in it than he had been the evening before, and he seemed to know it, and he adjusted his collar and his opinions accordingly whenever the subject of the bakery came up, which it did, often, in the way small towns keep a good story alive long after the coin has changed hands and the bread has been eaten. The blacksmith went on saying almost nothing. He raised the forge fire each morning before the sun cleared the grain elevator, and some mornings, before the first customer arrived, he carried a fresh log through the connecting door and set it by her oven without being asked. The way a man tends a fire, he has decided, without saying so, belongs partly to him. Spring came again the way it always came to that country, without apology, without softness, the frost breaking out of the ground, in a week of mud that swallowed wagon wheels to the axle, and then, just as suddenly, gave way to grass so green it looked painted on. A year had turned. The bakery's chimney had gone from a startling new thing on the skyline to a fixture, something a man driving in from the section lines looked for the way he looked for the water tower, a marker that told him he was close to town and close to bread. The ledger she kept now was a different ledger than the one from the mercantile's back room. Fewer debts owed to her in flour and favor, more coin changing hands outright, though she never turned away a hungry section hand for want of money, and everyone in Coldwater Bend understood by now that this was not weakness in her, but a kind of law she had made for herself and would not break. The wall between the forge and the oven had settled the way old brick settles, dark with 2 winters of smoke, warm on both sides at once, from November to March, so that men waiting on a plow blade to be reset would drift toward the bakery side of the wall without quite meaning to, drawn by heat and yeast, the same as they were drawn by the ring of hammer on iron. The town had stopped remarking on it. That was, perhaps, the truest measure of how settled it had become. Not praise, not talk, but the absence of talk, the way people stop commenting on a thing once it has simply become how the world is arranged. She sold her bread each morning at the counter Silas had built her, the wood gone smooth now under 2 years of coin and dough, and some evenings, after the last loaf had gone and the fire in both hearths had been banked low, the 2 of them sat on the step of the shared wall while the light went long and gold across the wheat, and neither of them said much of anything, because there was not much that needed saying anymore between 2 people who had built a life out of brick and flour and 11 men's unspoken debts, out of a 19-hour night neither of them ever spoke of again. The deed still hung, water-stained now, just inside the door, his name still small beneath hers, hired labor, paid in loaves. Neither of them had ever thought to change it. It did not seem, to either of them, like the kind of thing paper could improve. The town called it a marriage, when it spoke of it at all, and let the word stand for everything the 2 of them